Wheel of Genre, the show for listeners who have learned their lesson and will never travel again. Each week we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. Spies, mysteries, horrors, romance, SF, it's all on the shelf. And right now we are finishing up our horror series with Dan Simmons' Song of Kali. Zach, this week I am really interested in, I guess, really like the background, how to understand the background of this. Dan Simmons spent 2 days in Calcutta and walked away with this. That's super interesting to me.
Very impressive. I'm Bob. I'm interested in basically your introduction, Zach. Traveling, and then how dangerous is traveling and how well does it work for horror. But before we get into these ideas, Zach, what happens in Song of Kali?
Robert Lujac and his wife Amrita and daughter Victoria are sent to India to get the newest manuscript from the poet Das, who has been presumed dead for many, many years. When they get there, they are brought into a world of horror, but it's not the horror that most people think of. It's the horror of, I guess you could say, the urban environment of India in the 1980s. Dan Simmons really fills the pages with these really lush and ornate descriptions of absolute human suffering. There's really no other way to put it. Eventually, the poet is found, but by that time, we're kind of pulled into this underground world of cults, especially the cult of Kali and its tendency to sacrifice humans for its goals. The poet dies, his daughter's kidnapped, she dies, and they go back home and live their lives in quiet suffering. I guess that's pretty much how I would put a bow around the whole book. Is there anything you want to add to that, Bob?
Zach, the summary was really positive, and then it just turned, whoa, we took a steep downhill there. Yes, it's a tragic book. It's a very tragic book. It is a horror. It's scary. There are many scary elements, but the family is just destroyed by this book. And you don't expect it. So spoilers, I'm sorry, but it is a sad book, although thrilling in a way too. It's a thriller that has a very sad ending. What do you think? So he comes here, Dan Simmons goes to Calcutta and does, he said, 2 days of research. And now Bobby Lujac, Amrita, and Victoria are going there. Amrita hasn't been there in probably, I guess 30 years. And Lujac, Bob has never been there. They are overwhelmed. Amrita doesn't actually speak. She can understand a little bit of the local language in Calcutta, but she doesn't speak it very fluently. So everything is flying by them. They don't know exactly what to do. There are horror elements from the very beginning before we're even introduced to the cult. What were you thinking about when you were reading this, you said very vivid description, this kind of lush description of Calcutta?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it for me was, I was thinking about how best to categorize this book in terms of what kind of horror are we looking at. And I feel like this is a good maybe point of discussion for us to really leap into really the nitty gritty of this book. Because for me, it was a question of the two biggest words I'd seen attached to this book, which is fantasy and horror. And I think we can start there and kind of whittle our way down. I see a argument for both, but neither feels quite right to me. If you had to put your chips in one side, would you view this book as more of a fantasy or a horror?
I'd put them all in horror. I wouldn't put a single one in fantasy. So I'm surprised that it got the fantasy award. I can understand why. I think any genre would want this book to represent, or to give it an award, and it's an extremely good book. But for you, do you think it's fantasy? Do you think it's horror?
Horror, but it
Okay.
does make me. Yeah, I mean, okay, so yes, horror, but it does make me really think about the nature of fantasy and what it means to be a fantasy. Because obviously, this isn't like Tolkien fantasy. This isn't like, elves and dwarves and or sword and sorcery or anything like that. But if you think about fantasy novels that this could remind you of, you might think of something more like Neil Gaiman, American Gods, for example. Books where the kind of supernatural and spiritual world are intruding upon everyday life. if that makes sense. And I think there is a real argument for viewing Song of Kali as a book that at least, even if it doesn't confirm that this is what's actually going on, it certainly gestures with and plays with this idea. Do you feel like there's any merit to this?
I really like what you just said, because that's what I've been thinking too. If it's fantasy, there are so many ways to doubt it, because the way Dan Simmons does it, whenever Bobby has any of these experiences that are definitely fantastical or definitely from a fantasy book, there's always reason to doubt. He's been injured. He's just heard a gunshot. He can't hear very well. He's in the dark, so he imagines he's seeing these things. Even when he thinks Mdas comes back to life, maybe it's just that he never died and his death was a rumor and his condition is all from him having leprosy. So I feel like it's very much a horror in that, because horror, anytime there's a fantasy element, people don't believe you. Only you and your close friends, eventually, as you get them to be on your side, and then they are slowly killed off. That is the threshold for belief, is as soon as you believe you're in danger, or if you don't believe you're in danger, you're the only one who will survive because you see what others don't. Fantasy, it has to, I think, be acknowledged that it is fantastical. Even Harry Potter, it's an urban fantasy, and they live in a magical world. If people who aren't magical see them, then there is tension. But otherwise, if you're in Hogwarts, everyone knows that there is magic and there's no doubt.
Right. It feels fantastic to the reader, but to the characters in the story, they quickly accept it as a kind of baseline reality. And the story proceeds from there. And I think that what Dan Simmons does here, which is so genius actually, is he'll have his characters be unknowingly drugged right before seeing, a Kali idol crawling around on the ground and, tongue lapping the air and razor sharp teeth. He's taken a drug directly before this moment, but the character himself doesn't realize that he's been drugged. And actually the reader doesn't really realize he's been drugged until it takes a little bit of putting the puzzle pieces together. And then later he realizes, oh, I've actually been drugged. But in the moment, you're like, oh, is Dan Simmons actually doing this? Is Dan Simmons giving us, a walking, talking statue of Kali that, kills people, that sacrifices people? I think that these kind of filters between the truth of what's happening, whether that's the kind of drug experience, that's one aspect of it. But the other is the fact that the first story, when we're introduced to the idea that this Kali that all of these worshipers are sacrificing humans to or bringing bodies to, it's not coming firsthand. It's not that the narrator of the story sees this. He meets up with someone. He meets up with Jayaprakash. Jayaprakash is the storyteller. And then it turns out that Krishna is Sanjay from the story, the rich friend. When these character revelations of what their real identity is, it's not actually explicated in that moment. It's just wait a minute, are you Sanjay? And he's like, yes, laugh, leave. But I had to be 7 chapters back when we were told this story, this side character in the story is, he put it together, but I had to use the search function on my PDF. But I think one of the strengths of Dan Simmons actually is his ability to really tie up the story. He makes his stories feel immersive because of how the world is constructed and how the plot interweaves. There's a story within a story, and that internal story breaks out into the larger story and enfolds the people in it. And we find out elements of that smaller story within a story aren't actually true or have been embellished, and we don't know what to believe anymore. How do you feel like this compares to the other four Dan Simmons works that we've read? Do you see the same Dan Simmons here?
Well, first, I want to apologize. Last time we read Dan Simmons, I said I'm not reading Dan Simmons again after reading Endymion too. But Hyperion, masterpiece. This also extremely good. So I'm very happy we read it. I think it's definitely Dan Simmons seems to really enjoy engaging with real famous texts. It's intertextual because here he's talking about real poets from Calcutta or from India. He's talking about real things that happen with their associations, like Mdas and his friendship with Yeats. in Hyperion, he's talking about Keats, he's talking about Shakespeare. Dan Simmons is really interested in bringing poetry into, I guess, other genres, or just experimenting with poetry, or that is his inspiration. And I really like this too. The narrator is a poet and works for the literary journal, not a real one, but Other Voices. And I think it's a very interesting character to have who's somewhat fairly level-headed, wants to go in, do a pretty good news job, even though they're not really a reporter. They're just trying to get some facts. And I like his, I don't know, he's very, for a horror narrator, I feel like he's a very down-to-earth, kind of regular person. His family is also very normal. And I feel that he is not unreliable at all. And that feels quite different from other horrors. I feel there are many similarities between this and an H.P. Lovecraft story, but we have a very just level-headed narrator. What do you think of, the connections between other texts? If Lovecraft is always creating his own things to reference to, it seems Dan Simmons wants to connect to a tradition, like to a canon, whereas Lovecraft is trying to create his own canon. And I think there's a big difference, too, between the way you go into that, where Lovecraft says, look, you disintegrate as a person, and Dan Simmons seems to be more you can carry on, or at least you try your best to stay level. Do you feel there's comparison between those two authors?
I think that there's a huge amount of overlap between Dan Simmons and H.P. Lovecraft, but I think that a lot of that for me comes with the feeling of it, like the texture of the story. Okay. And yes, I agree with what you're saying before, but like to explore the textural similarities before I talk about the textual similarities with Dan Simmons, it's what he's pulling from here is the kind of fear of a kind of cosmic entity that's larger than humanity, and yet somehow guiding humanity in very destructive ways. I mean, the easiest reference, like cultural touchstone of this book, is Call of Cthulhu. With, they find the notebook and it's describing these strange rituals, these dances that are going around all across the world. It's all happening almost like simultaneously, and it's all for this ancient deity. What he's playing with is a kind of, I think it's very out of fashion, probably for good reason, but a very kind of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom style, like fear of these strange rituals of other religions and cultures, and is there ever, is it wrong to write an anti-human sacrifice story? Maybe that's one thing that an American author can, it's okay, to talk about how strange, a human sacrifice ritual is, or how scary it is, using that as the basis for a horror premise. That being said, so we have that element, but there's also the element of how Dan Simmons describes bodies, and what happens to bodies after death. I think one of the most disturbing sections of this book is that story within a story that I mentioned earlier, when the body is pulled from the river, and it's bloated. It's described as looking like a starfish, and he feels something moving inside of the body, and he has to carry it, and it's just heavy. It's very visceral and very disgusting because it's a person, and yet it's host to all of this other life and dead. It's dead and host to all of this other life in a way that makes it visually inhuman. He talks about this horrible moment where he lays the head down and a like slug-like thing crawls out of the eye hole and pokes its little eye pods out and then withdraws back in. Absolutely monstrous, just terrible. But something about that reminded me a lot of the way H.P. Lovecraft, just writes about horrible, inhumane monsters. And it's not so much the tentacles or the iPods on stalks, but it's the way he doesn't describe what's inside that body, the way he doesn't describe what's living and growing and feeding inside of that person. that to me is so Lovecraftian because he leaves it to your imagination about what horrors of the rivers have taken root inside of this corpse. I don't know. What about you? Do you feel like this connection to Lovecraft is fair?
I think it's very clear. I mean, Call of Cthulhu, Song of Kali, they sound very similar as titles. And while this is a much longer, expansive book, and what we've read by Lovecraft is usually shorter. Mountains of Madness or The Call of Cthulhu, they're short stories. But this, we have so much time to see all of the, I guess, industrial horror, not industrial horror, just city horror. And you see all of the actual conditions of people and just regular people. And that is a horror element. One, for him being someone who doesn't belong there, not understanding any customs and constantly putting himself and his family in danger, and then also seeing the terrible conditions that people are living in. Then I guess that's the expansion that Dan Simmons goes beyond what H.P. Lovecraft is doing. But I think when Amrita and Robert are talking about what's going on, he says that he keeps hearing the Song of Kali, and it's driving him a little bit crazy. He even gets, after all of these terrible things happen, after they lose Victoria, and they think they're going to get her back, but they find out, no, she's actually already gone. They go back to America. They're there, I think, for a few years, or at least almost a complete year. They've kind of gone back to lives. They're not really talking to each other because how can they? But Robert starts to go so insane that he's hearing the Song of Kali, and he's hearing the poems that M. Das was writing that are all about everything burning, people killing each other, blood shooting up from everywhere. It's the Song of Kali, all of this violence. And he gets on the plane, he has his gun, and he's going to go and just kill Krishna, kill M. Das again, kill anyone involved in this cult of Kali. But it reminds me a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, and I think this is a huge difference between them. I don't know if Simmons is consciously engaging with Lovecraft here, but it seems like he really might be, and writing his own version. And I think a big departure, I already said it, but I think this is a big departure, is where he makes the decision to get back on the plane. Because Robert is going to go, he's going to become one of these, not intentionally, but in doing violence, he is going to do what has happened to him, and he's going to become, incidentally, one of the cult members of Kali just by doing violence. But he makes the decision to stop. And I think in Lovecraft, you can't do that. Once you read the once you read the Necronomicon, or once you see any of these eldritch gods, you go insane. You cannot function anymore. And the people around you, if you tell them about it, they will go too far like you did and also go insane. And I think Dan Simmons could have done that and maybe was writing towards that, but I think he consciously decided to stop. What do you think about this? What's the difference here between what Lovecraft wants to do and what Simmons wants to do?
Well, consciously decided to stop, sure, but maybe even wants to convey a different message. He wants to convey a message of hopefulness rather than hopelessness. I mean, what he was going to do was become a mass shooter, and not just like targeted assassinations. He seemed like he was about to snap inside of like a public transportation hall. You know what I mean? Like, it seemed like his initial goal was to just go to India and take out as many people as possible, was what it seemed like he was going to do. But ultimately, he kind of came to his senses. And I think that him returning back and kind of turning the keys in the ignition of his life, really, him and his wife are going to try to have another child. He starts writing kind of like Tolkien-esque fairy tales, like about, I wish I had written down what it was, but like a very curious cat and a yes. brave, just like an eagle who couldn't fly. And he just said he buys a blank note. He doesn't write poetry anymore. He just buys a blank notebook and he writes these kind of like hopeful children's stories. It seems like Simmons thinks that there is a possibility for a kind of like triumph of rationality over the violent irrationality of what he calls the Song of Kali, but I think can really be abstracted to the idea that might makes right, or all power is what's the quote, like all power is an exercise of violence or something like that. It's
right,
whatever the quote was. Yeah. And when he talks at the end, he talks about there are other gods. It's not all just Kali or nothing. There are other things in this world, which ultimately is not a message that diminishes from the fantasy slash horror aspect, because it's not like, oh, all that's fake, all that's made up, all that is, fantasy, all that is illusion, all that is myth. No, no, no. He's saying there are other gods that we can align ourselves with, and I choose that today.
Hmm.
So, yeah, he's. I guess that's what makes Dan Simmons such a good writer, right? He's not just going to do Lovecraft in this book. He could have, one could argue that Hyperion was Dan Simmons doing all of these different genres and putting it all in this one book. But in this one, he could have just done Lovecraft, but in the end, he always manages to turn it into a Dan Simmons book, and that's what makes him great.
One thing too that I think is very Dan Simmons in the, I guess, the light at the end of this tunnel, or the positivity, the choice to not follow Kali or Kali. When he's talking to Amrita, Amrita is a mathematician, and she's telling him about a theory of other dimensions, black holes. And he says, what if Calcutta is, at the very beginning, they call it a miasma. And they say it's a place of disease, a place that by it, not even the conditions of it, but there's something evil about the place. And he says, what if it is just a black hole and it drew us there and took everything away? But then Amrita says that there are other ideas too of black holes becoming a kind of tunnel. And she says, energy might tunnel out into another place and time, a fresh new universe full of blazing light. I thought that was a great super sci-fi answer to horror. To escape the horror, you go through it, you come out. It's also very much like Dune. The fear passes you, and then you're the only thing there. Very sci-fi for old Dan.
Yeah, it's funny, this book being written in 1985, when he does that, that comparison with the black holes. He says, "Oh, she summarized some scientist named Stephen Hawking."
Oh yeah,
and it's just like a lot of the ideas went over my head, but it's just funny to see. Like, this is why you read old books, right? To see how things change, see how things have changed since the time they were written. Whether that's cultural attitudes, whether that's the commonplace, pop understanding of scientific ideas.
Yeah. Zach, wait, sorry. Speaking of, since you just said that, that makes me think, do you find any relationship between Dan Simmons and other horror writers? If we're saying that Dan Simmons is taking Lovecraft or expanding from Lovecraft, do you think that it's a direct, I guess, descendants? Like, are they directly related, or can you see Dan Simmons fitting in with any other horror traditions?
I think really, if I was going to place Dan Simmons' voice side by side with anyone else, it's probably Stephen King. And we haven't had a good chance to read Stephen King together. I read him a lot as a kid. I would really like to get back to him, but three things.
Three things.
Went from 1 to 2 to
Escalated
3
quickly.
things. Yeah. Really cinched that connection to me. One of which is the quiet family moments. It's not all just pulse pounding horror or, action adventure or, oh, there's been a kidnapping, these kind of like, thriller sequences. No, there are these quiet moments with the family where you see the kind of interior lives within a marriage. That to me is very, very Stephen King. The other element is the fact that the narrator of the story, the protagonist, is an author. And that's something Stephen King loves to do. And it's kind of like a write what you know kind of a thing. Nothing easier than having like yourself be the narrator. But the final thing is, I'm not sure if this is, maybe I wouldn't call this just a Stephen King-ism, but the way that the narrator is like a wisecracker, he's a bit of a wise ass. And it was funny reading initial reviews of this, describing the narrator as an intellectual, which is so interesting to me because I don't associate wisecrackism with intellectualism personally today, 2024, myself, but I think that there was something in the water in the 60s, 70s, 80s where it was like, oh, if someone is sarcastic and they are cynical and they always have a quick-witted response and they hate authority, they are an intellectual. And it's like a Gen X thing, maybe. But like people who I would associate with this mindset include Stephen King. His book On Writing is full of this tone and this voice. It's just omnipresent. Harlan Ellison, who we're currently in the midst of reading his entire anthology, Dangerous Visions. All of those episodes are up on YouTube if you haven't checked that out, or if you haven't checked out the anthology. Listeners, please
smash
check
that
out.
like button.
Smash that like button and go hit that playlist. But yeah, like Harlan Ellison's entire editorial voice is this kind of wisecrack jokester. And Harlan Ellison just so happens to be Dan Simmons' number one mentor, the person who unlocked the literary kingdom for him. I don't know. What do you think? Am I onto something here, or you think I'm off track?
No, I think that's a very interesting thing. Yes, Harlan Ellison. He's even this book is dedicated to Ellison. And didn't he say that if whatever else he'll be known for, the best thing, I think you told me this, the thing he wants to be remembered for is discovering Dan Simmons, because Dan Simmons will be such a talent. So they had a really close relationship. I hadn't thought of that, though. His editor at Other Voices is kind of a Harlan Ellison, because he says no one else can get along with him. He has no friends because he's so rude to people on the phone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think so. He's very much a Harlan Ellison or an Avram Davidson, the wisecracker, someone who is kind of pretty good at taking care of themselves, but just barely making it with a literary journal. For the comparison with Stephen King, I think that's really interesting. I think Dan Simmons and Stephen King are really underrated. Stephen King obviously has made a lot of money, but I think he's a much better writer than people give him credit for. Even Dan Simmons calls him trash in this book, or at least the narrator does. I think he's a great writer, but people are often disappointed with his endings. And we were talking with H.P. Lovecraft about I'm just going to keep saying threshold, but the relationship between what is definitely real and then what is fantastical or a monster, and when do I doubt and when do I believe? And in Stephen King, often the way out of horror is still supernatural. You have to do something insane, and you have to actually go through a supernatural ghost boss battle, and it always feels quite corny. It happens in happens in The Outsider. But I feel like here Dan Simmons has decided it becomes very much a human-centered solution, and the solution that is either extreme violence or the solution is just stay home, and you have to let go of your old conception of yourself and move on. It is a very measured, calm, maybe healthy way out, as opposed to H.P. Lovecraft, spiral into insanity. Stephen King, insane fight with a clown, and then Dan Simmons is more real, I guess, more realistic.
Well, I will say about we probably don't need to go down too deep of a path on how good of an author Stephen King is, but I will say I think Dan Simmons is a better writer than Stephen King. But culturally, how many images of Stephen King's are burned into our brain forever? Universally, everyone is universally conscious of a clown in a gutter saying, "Georgie, come down," and I don't think anyone can name off the top of their head a Dan Simmons image except perhaps the Shrike, but that even that is kind of like obscure to the
pretty niche.
Person. Pretty niche, pretty niche. So there's, I think that the style and tone of Stephen King leaves something to be desired, but the imagination of Stephen King is it's the fertile crescent of the culture. So, okay, all right. There's a lot coming.
Not sure what that means. Okay. What do you think of? Because this, if this is a horror story and we're talking about what choices do you make as a character when you're in the middle of horror, and we've seen lots of horror movies, characters make bad decisions, and often that is part of the suspense of thinking no, why aren't you doing that, or why are you doing that? You're making a bad decision. Here, I'm interested in the whole idea of going traveling in the first place. It is a dubious offer. I mean, M. Doss has been dead, I think it's almost a decade, no, 7 years, I think. And Harper's approaches him because he works for Harper's, and they say, look, someone is sending us promises that, that M. Doss is still alive and writing. They send a copy of it, and M. Doss is someone who's writing about Mother Teresa, and everything is very calm and very optimistic. And then his editor, the Harlan Ellison character, reads it, and he says, "This is just porn." The poems they send don't seem anything like M. Doss, but he still and he says, "Do not go there. I've been to Calcutta. It is a dangerous place. You should not go there." Why are they sending you to? No one knows who you are. Why would Harper's pay for you, your wife, and your child to go there? This is extremely suspect. And he still makes the decision to go. Then when they get there, nothing goes right. Their driver doesn't show up. They arrive at the airport. The driver doesn't show up. Some guy named Krishna shows up and says, "Yes, I will be your driver. I am the driver now." And nothing, the lights don't work in the car. Anything they ask Krishna to do, he says, "No, I can't do it. I'm sorry." Everything is going wrong, and he's still making the decision to try and find out if this very unlikely scenario is true. What do you think of this horror trope of the, oh my God, why are you doing this?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't have a problem with it. You mean
I liked it, but I just...
Yeah, I mean, I like it too. I think that a good story should involve a certain element of adventure and getting out of the character's comfort zone, because that's, it's either a stranger comes to town or it's a hero has to go on a fantastic journey. It's one or the other. Pick one. That being said, oftentimes when it's the hero goes out of their comfort zone into a strange new world, many times it's a kind of like a fictional place. You know what I mean? But Calcutta, or I guess now it's called Kolkata. I need to double check that. Oh, we should have fact checked this before we hit record. But Calcutta is a real place, and it is somewhere you can go today. And I think it's really interesting that the vision that he presented of it is so extreme, to the point of saying its misery is supernatural. You know what I mean? There's something cosmic about the level of suffering there. And a lot of people have pointed out that, this might be people from Calcutta might not like this depiction. So for me, I think what I prefer to do is to kind of really sidestep the question of whether this is an accurate representation of Kolkata, and to really just say, like, look, this is a literary work. His time in Calcutta, his 2 days, could have provided images that he put in the text. It could have no relation to the book, the final text we ended up reading. But it seems to me like for Simmons, he works on the page. He's not a reporter. He's someone who works within the text and fleshes out text. So for me, I try to just treat it like that, as a kind of self-contained thing away from the real world.
That's fair. Yeah. I suppose anytime anyone not from a culture writes a book about another culture, people love to complain. I think it's interesting too that he uses he's done this before too in his other writing. And then Frank Herbert does it too at the beginning of every chapter of Dune, except for Frank Herbert is making those up. Here though, Dan Simmons is using real pieces of poetry from poets, either probably not from people who have been to Calcutta and are from India. And all of them are about how much they hate Calcutta and how dangerous and terrible Calcutta is. So I think for anyone, Calcutta has grown a lot, but in the 80s, I mean, still I think 60% of people with leprosy come from that area. And in the 80s, it would have been much higher. So it is a very poor area, and it is a frightening area. There were, probably not super prevalent, but cults, and you found an article about cults where people are being murdered. So it is a scary place to go. I think it's a very interesting attraction though, because if he's a poet and he hasn't quite had enough success yet, and he's being lured there by this promise of DOS. He has written about DOS, he's published things about DOS, and now the promise, or not even the promise, just the temptation that DOS might still be alive, I think is a great plot for the adventure. I'm going to prove that all of my work that I've been devoted to is worth it, and that my poetry is also worth it. And I think it's such an interesting thing to go find someone you know is dead and then to keep pursuing because you just have an inkling that something is at the bottom of this story. When you find out, it's too late, I guess, and things really take control of you. But I think it's interesting, not just the adventure, but also the promise of your wildest dreams, not your wildest dreams, but what you've been working towards could be true.
What I want to know is you've previously sworn off Dan Simmons. Then you just now read Song of Kali.
Mistake. Yeah.
Well, that's what I want to know. Would you come back to Dan Simmons? He has apparently an entire horror career. Like, we've only read his sci-fi works. Apparently he's like just as prolific in the horror genre, has a mystery book or two, and then also has those SF books that are rewriting the Iliad and the Odyssey in the far future on like Mars or something like that. Would you read Dan Simmons again? Are you back in? Or do you feel like this is just a fluke, a start of the career fluke?
Oh, no, I'm back in. I think he is very, we've talked about how he's different from other horror writers, how he is engaged in the horror canon, and then also bringing in other canons, bringing in lots of genres, and really not just throwing them in there, but working with them and expanding them, trying to connect them and see if there are already connections underneath. And I think when we read, I think it was Troilus and Cressida, and you said that Auden said about Troilus and Cressida, the Shakespeare play, that there are three kinds of writers. There's the bad writers, and then there's the good and the great. And the great experiment and try to break out of their own mold. And I think that is kind of what Dan Simmons does, because you can see elements of Song of Kali in parts of Hyperion. There's the horror of the Shrike. There is Kali moving through the darkness, coming closer and closer. There are also the really close and tragic family relationships, like with the story of the monk and the story of the priest in Hyperion. I am very interested in reading him,
the
because
father and daughter relationship.
Even though
Sorry to interrupt, but
father and daughter relationship, exactly, and losing your daughter, I think he goes for it, and he might fail a lot, but his successes are extremely original, a great contribution to the genre, and just a wild ride. Very, very fun books to read, except for Endymion, parts 1 or 2.
Yeah. Well, I agree. For me, I love his literary maximalism, and this is something that the more Dan Simmons I read, the more I notice that he loves writing these paragraphs that are just one sentence long, but have like 2 semicolons, a hyphen. Just, I guess I could read one, but here's one paragraph, or sorry, here's one sentence from Dan Simmons that is just one of several that are like this. Yet on every second or third floor, there were open-windowed glimpses of humanity inhabiting these druidic shambles, bare bulbs swinging, bobbing heads, peeled walls with plaster rotting off the white rib bones of the building, garish illustrations of multi-armed deities clipped from magazines and taped crookedly to walls or window panes, the cries of children playing, running, fleeing through the knife-blackened alleys, the wail of infants half heard, and everywhere the random movement caught in the corner of one's vision, the sibilant rush of the bus's tires on wet clay and tarmac, and the sight of sheeted figures lying like corpses in the sidewalk shadows. One sentence right there. And it was like a Where's Waldo book. So anytime we read a Dan Simmons book, I tend to clip out these stupid long sentences and just kind of save them. And for me, I want to continue reading I want to read a Dan Simmons mystery novel and see how he puts this style of sentence into his works there. I'm back in on his career. I'm excited to see what's next. So I vote next time we hit those genres, we load it up with a couple Simmons titles.
More Simmons. He gets a lot out of his trips, 2 days, and then he could put that much detail into his little journal while he's sitting around.
Well,
yeah,
that's
I'm
the
very
thing.
much
I
up for more
personally don't
Simmons.
think he wrote any of this on that trip. You know what I mean? I think he
While
went on a
there,
trip
yeah,
and said,
yeah.
"Oh, I think his reaction was terrible place," but then he came back, and I feel like this style of writing is on the page. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's someone who tinkers with sentences. He's a writer. He's not someone who like sees something and then translates that image that he saw with his eyes onto the page. I don't think that's what he does.
It's an on the page guy. It's not really a comment. That was sorry.
Yeah. Well,
on the page guy.
Next up, we are doing something a little bit different than what we normally do. We are diving into historical fiction. Wow. I think this will be the first time we've read historical fiction. So this will be a new genre for us. I'm looking forward to seeing what we'll find. Yeah. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.